Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike O'Malley here with the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for October 7th, 2020, recorded around 3:05 p.m. Eastern Time. Today's main focus is, of course, going to be Hurricane Delta, which, as of last night, did make landfall as a little bit of a weaker storm, and this is resultant from vertical wind shear that came out of the out of the northwesterly direction that helped to actually impinge our storm and weaken it on approach towards the northern coast of the Yucatan. But it has now since reemerged, and we can kind of see that it's taken a little bit more of a westerly trend today. And this is south and west of what most of the model guidance thought yesterday, which is very important going forth with time to see how this all kind of interacts down the road. But if we switch into a closer loop here of Delta, we can very clearly see that we have a deep convective burst occurring, a very well organized banding structure here in the center of circulation right in here. And now this is still bringing some impacts, of course, to the Yucatan Peninsula. The far outer bands of it is still producing some very heavy rainfall and squally conditions, but the storm has it's expanded in size quite exponentially because the storm made landfall, and the land, obviously the land friction caused the storm to spread out a little bit. It caused the very small inner core to get more so disrupted, and it was able to spread the storm out. So this is bad news. This is good news in the sense that this won't be able to deepen by 70 miles per hour within a relative 24-hour time frame. But this is also bad news because now the size of the storm, it's a more expansive wind field, and as this moves across the Gulf of Mexico, now all this storm surge is going to be piled up in the right front quadrant of the storm, and this is where you're going to see the highest storm surge to the right of the storm track as it's moving off towards the northwest for the next few days, then turning generally northward. You're going to have most of that storm surge be piled in to the north or toward the east side of the storm. So this has only really caused much more of a dangerous situation for the Gulf Coast. And again, as we talked about yesterday, whatever weakening does happen down here, and what did happen doesn't matter for the Gulf Coast because this is expected to be a major hurricane on approach into the Gulf Coast. And again, we can very clearly see that we have these deep convective bands rotating around. So the inner core structure is trying to get better organized, and this is a relatively large storm now, so it's going to take a little bit more time for this to consolidate, but once it does, it's really off to the races. Now, the official forecast, again, from the National Hurricane Center, put into a graphical forecast is, so here's the storm right now, Category 2, Hurricane Delta, sitting off the north coast of the Yucatan. Hurricane warnings remain in effect for the Yucatan Peninsula as hurricane conditions will persist through the remainder of this afternoon, decreasing through this evening. The newest addition, though, as of the 11 o'clock advisory, is we now have hurricane watches, hurricane and storm surge watches for portions of the eastern Texas and Louisiana coastline. So the other big change that we've seen in the last couple of days is instead of being a weaker storm as it approaches the Louisiana coastline, this is expected now to be a major hurricane, Category 3, potentially even a Category 4 hurricane upon landfall. Now, the good news is that while this will be we'll kind of start off with some good news here. The good news is that while this will be a strong hurricane, it will be weakening on the time of landfall. Bad news, that doesn't really change any of the impacts, and this is unfortunately going to track in some of the areas affected by Hurricane Laura only a few short months ago. And unfortunately, it looks like that Lake Charles, unfortunately, Vermilion Bay, some of those regions that were devastated by Hurricane Laura, by that very powerful Category 4, now could face much of a similar situation once again, where you're going to be faced with a Category 3 or 4 hurricane bearing down on your location. Now, again, we have hurricane watches all the way to the East Texas coastline, and there is some uncertainty as to how far west this gets, and that's why this track forecast, you can see the cone here, is a little bit far off towards the right, or I'm sorry, off towards the left here. And you can see, though, on the left side of it, it's very narrow. So there is kind of this narrowing corridor, but from East Texas, Port Arthur, over towards Lake Charles, Vermilion Bay, etc., there's a very real possibility of a significant hurricane barreling down in a couple of short days. And again, hurricane watches have been issued. We have tropical storm watches all the way down through near the Bolivar Peninsula, tropical storm watches all the way through, down near Lake Pontchartrain. So this is a very large storm. And again, that storm surge is going to be a big issue. And we can see how this kind of matches up here on the storm surge forecast from the Hurricane Center. Forecasting really from about Port O'Connor down through High Island, Galveston Bay, and the Sabine Lake, about 1 to 3 feet of storm surge for that expected location. So not a tremendous amount, but 1 to 3 feet of storm surge is going to be a big problem here. Now, after that time, again, down for the Vermilion Bay region, upwards of 7 to 11 feet of storm surge. Even Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Bourne could see 4 to 6 feet of storm surge, with Lake Pontchartrain seeing around 3 to 5 feet, and even all the way down through Mobile Bay and the Alabama-Florida border, you're going to experience some minor coastal flooding with 2 to 4 feet above normally dry ground of storm surge. This is a big problem, folks, and it doesn't matter whether the storm is weakening by the time it gets there. Hurricane Sally was, not, for all intensive purposes, it wasn't a Hurricane Laura. It still brought a tremendous amount of storm surge, heavy rain, etc. And, unfortunately, some of these areas that were devastated by Hurricane Laura a couple of short months ago now have to deal with a very real threat of a significant storm surge and wind threat once again, along with an additional maybe 6 to 10 inches of heavy rainfall, freshwater rainfall flooding. So keep in mind that it's kind of a 1-2 punch, that these areas that were devastated could be devastated once again by a devastating hurricane, a very powerful hurricane moving into this environment, into the Gulf. It's expected to strengthen, and unfortunately probably won't have enough time to significantly weaken by the time it gets there. This is a very real problem and is going to cause some significant storm surge in that region. So take this very seriously if you live down there, because this is the real deal. And once again, for the second time this year, you have a very significant hurricane threat barreling down on your location. Now, if we look here at the HWRF forecast here, this is we'll go here to the 200 millibar winds in the atmosphere. So this is the 200 millibar winds, and what we're looking at is really your steering pattern, or not really necessarily your steering pattern, but the wind flow pattern at about 200 millibars. So you're looking high up in the atmosphere. We can very clearly see what is setting the stage for deep intensification across the Gulf. First of all, this is obviously our hurricane down here. This is by 15 Zulu time. We'll move that out to 18 Z. So this is just about an hour ago. So we have our storm that's sitting off the north coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. Of course, this is the Gulf Coast. That's Louisiana right there. That's Alabama, Florida, Mississippi. So what's happening here is we have this upper-level anticyclone now moving out over the Gulf of Mexico. This upper-level anticyclone is going to be moving kind of with the storm, basically. So we'll kind of move this out here. Our anticyclone moves generally off towards the west here in that direction. We get a general northwesterly heading on our storm here. And again, the reason why that this is happening is we have this trough of low pressure digging in here across these, kind of the southwest United States. And this trough is trying to eventually steer our storm, but the mid-level flow right now is generally out of the northwesterly direction until this trough slides over. Now, what's happening here, again, is we have a broad area of anticyclonic flow across the Gulf, and of course our upper-level anticyclone kind of associated with our storm. So these factors allow for some gradual intensification, and we can see that our storm actually gets down into the upper 930s, so potentially even stronger pressure-wise in terms of what it was in the Yucatan Peninsula. Of course, it was 140 miles per hour in the Yucatan, but pressure's 950 or so. Very high for a storm that's only a near Category 5 intensity. So for all intents and purposes, this could be stronger than what it was in the Yucatan Peninsula by this time. And now you're starting to get into some complicating factors. We get the trough now to kind of move across, and it's affecting very slowly, but this kind of trough wave, the shortwave energy, resides across the southwest. But now our storm has started to take more of that turn towards the north. It's now coming up here between the ridge out here across Florida and the trough. These two factors are kind of setting the edge between one another, and you get this kind of natural born weakness in this area right through here. Now, exactly where it takes this turn, though, is going to mean all of the difference in the track and intensity. And we'll talk about that here intensity-wise in a moment. But there is several factors. We could start to see the storm still turn a little bit further west and make that turn a little bit slower and eventually kind of come up here more so on the west side of Louisiana and on the east side of Texas. Or we could see a situation where we start to see this turn much like the H-Wharf is showing and come up something like this. And there is still some differences that are being kind of forecast right now. So it's a little too hard to kind of narrow down that window, but we can see, much like with the Euro or what the H-Wharf is showing, that the storm starts to take that turn and then comes up and then makes landfall here in central and western Louisiana. So it's very important. Now, again, keep in mind, though, that the storm is going to be much larger now and prompting a threat for east central Louisiana. So this is still going to be a problem for those areas, despite if it makes landfall on the west side of Louisiana. It's now a larger storm than it was back in the Yucatan Peninsula. So that's very important to understand, that this is, going to only aggregate that storm surge problem even more. Going into an already very prone area to storm surge, now you're only aggregating that by a decent amount. So you now have a very dangerous situation on hand here for going forth with time. So this is something that we're going to have to watch, and again, it's going to make all of the difference as to what eventually does happen. Now, after that point in time, though, our storm starts to make that north turn, and this is where the shear kind of gets the storm. We have this big upper level trough here, and this trough, again, is creating shear out of the southwest here, and this is now starting to impact our storm. And if we actually look here on the H-Wharf forecast, the 700 to 400 millibar relative humidity product, just to get you familiar real quick with what's what, this green here, that's your moist air, and your brown is dry air in the atmosphere. So if we move forward here in time, we can see by hour 39 here, we'll go out to hour 42. What's happening is, you notice that this brown color here, this dry air, is now kind of creating this moat here. And it's separating the inner core structure from this kind of band here, this one band of moist air in convection. Now, because we have southwesterly shear, again, this is only going to help to aggregate the transplant of this dry air. And whatever dry air makes it onto the southwest side of the storm, that southwest shear now has a clear-cut pathway into the inner core. And we can see that it really starts to take a toll. I mean, it's still a very strong storm here, don't get me wrong. 947 millibars, that's, easily Category 3, high-end Cat 3, low-end Cat 4. But it's weakening at this time because this dry air is now getting punched in. And it's going to continue to do so. And if we move it right up until landfall, we can see that the dry air actually makes it on the south side here of the inner core. And now the storm is weakened into the to near 960 millibars. So we've gone from a strong storm to maybe a storm that is of a category low-end Cat 3, high-end Cat 2, more than a high-end Cat 4, low-end Cat 4, high-end Cat 4. So this does matter, because if this dry air doesn't get in, the storm is going to stay stronger for longer. Now, the other thing that's going to be happening, and we'll kind of switch this, the one thing that's really going to matter is when exactly does it make that turn. And if it makes that turn, a little bit sooner, we can see here, this is the HWRF sea surface temperature forecast. And you notice right now how the water temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, at least for kind of its partial duration, is in the upper 29 degrees Celsius range. Now, again, this is very favorable and all, but you look what you have lurking right here. You have your more shallow water, but you also have water that isn't as warm, and not as warm water. These water temperatures are not supportive of these high-end magnitude hurricanes. So what you end up having is a situation where you can't get an intense hurricane. You can't get a high-end Cat 4, a high-end Cat 5, whatever, in that northern zone. Now, in the southern zone, of course, and of course down in there, in the Caribbean and Yucatan, but we kind of move this forward. Now, look what happens. So this is, hour 30. This is by 2 p.m. Thursday, 2 p.m. tomorrow. Now, you notice this is kind of the cold wake left in kind of the overall path here of Delta. Now, as this starts to move northward, again, this is not very deep water, and that warm water does not extend to a very deep layer. Why? Because we just had a cold front come through, basically stretched out across this entire region. So this area is not necessarily a very deep plateau of water right now. It's not deep enough. So what you end up actually getting is, you can very clearly see as our storm now moves northward, we get the storm to move into relatively cooler and shallower water temperatures, and our sea surface temperatures drop into about the 27 to 26 degrees Celsius area. So now you're suddenly coming from an area conducive for intense hurricanes to an area that is relatively unfavorable for intense hurricanes. Now, this very clearly still supports a hurricane, and a rather intense one at that, but we continue to move this forward. That dry air, the shear, the lower sea surface temperatures, it looks like that the storm won't have enough oomph, basically, won't have enough energy to continue to deepen all the way up until landfall, which is a very good thing. But if that turn isn't as, it really doesn't occur on time like the models are predicting, let's say it kind of moves up something more like that on the east side of Texas there, you look at your sea surface temperature profile, and suddenly it becomes a little bit better, where you have marginally more favorable sea surface temperature profiles, and basically lasts all the way up until landfall. So there is the possibility that if this gets further west, or further west in the short term, and doesn't take that turn as predicted, that we may see the storm maybe get a little bit stronger, but not really expecting anything that significant going forth with in terms of the wind. We're not expecting a major Category 5 to be making landfall. But in every single right, 100-mile-per-hour winds is still significant enough. And on top of the wind, let's forget about the wind for a second. That storm surge that we talked about earlier, that 7 to 11 feet of storm surge for Vermilion Bay, even 1 to 3 feet for Port O'Connor, the Bolivar Peninsula, Galveston Bay, Sabine Pass, Lake Pontchartrain, Lake Bourne, Ocean Springs, Mobile Bay. Those areas that I'm calling out could still see, especially Vermilion Bay and near Cameron, Louisiana, that got devastated by Hurricane Laura. This is a dangerous situation. You don't need, 150-mile-per-hour winds to make it devastating. So my point is, take this very seriously, treat it as a real threat, and understand that this is a very consequential situation. If you are told to evacuate, evacuate, because as we saw with Hurricane Laura, that storm surge is going to get you every single time if you're not ready. So evacuate if you so can. All right. Well, that being said, I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon. Of course, I am Michael O'Malley. And yes, I will have another video update later this afternoon, so look out for that. Otherwise, have a great rest of your afternoon and early evening. I am Michael O'Malley. I'll talk to you guys again later this afternoon.